Megan is our co-host this week.
Hello.
And this week we are taking a jump into the past. This week's case takes place in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1930s. So during this time, Cleveland was an up-and-coming city, even though, everything that was going on during the Great Depression at the time. It was growing economically, largely due to the amount of immigrants that were working in the steel and manufacturing industries around there. There were a lot of conventions and expositions scheduled to be hosted there in the coming years, and things were really looking up for the city. So during this time of prosperity and stuff, a man called the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run was terrorizing the streets of Cleveland. Have you heard this case, Megan?
I have not heard this case.
Perfect. Okay. So in the 1930s, Kingsbury Run was basically like the slums. It was a place where the people who were displaced by the Great Depression had to live. It was filled with trash, bars, brothels, and gambling dens. It also had a major railway running through it, which was perfect for the transient people who live there because they would just hop on the train and kind of go, wherever. Because people came and went and it was a poor area of town, it made the perfect hunting ground for the butcher to pick his victims. In September of 1934, get out your pencil, Megan. You're going to want to keep these dates in your mind. Just kidding. Maybe not, but you might want to. There, she's got one. So in September of 1934, a young man just enjoying a day at the beach, on Lake Erie, discovered the torso of a woman. The torso was half buried, rotting, and her legs were cut off at the knees. There was also some sort of chemical preservative used on the body that made her skin red and leathery. They searched nearby, but her head was never found, and she was also never identified. She's only known as the Lady of the Lake. 2 weeks earlier, human vertebrae and ribs had been found on another nearby beach. People are like, what is happening? Why are body parts just showing up everywhere?
This case does sound familiar, but we'll see once you get more into it. Lady of the Lake sounded familiar. But yeah, I was going to say this whole scene sounds like a Jack the Ripper town, brothels, desperation, and sadness. Not good. Not a good mix.
He, an article that I read actually talked about, compared him to Jack the Ripper and how he was worse than Jack the Ripper. So it's funny that you brought up that, correlation. And also, Lady of the Lake sounded familiar to me also. I feel like I had heard another podcast on it, but this did not sound familiar at all. And that's all you hear about her. So I may be another Lady of the Lake.
Oh, okay. Maybe it is, because nothing sounded familiar except for that. And I made that correlation because I'm a genius, obviously. But that's bad if he's worse.
So a year later, in September 1935, two boys racing down a hill literally ran into a man with no head. He was naked except for socks. His body was clean and drained of blood. He was also castrated and had rope burns on both of his arms. So the coroner determined that his cause of death was decapitation, meaning he was alive when his head was cut off, which is nuts. So this victim was actually able to be identified through fingerprints as 28-year-old Edward Andrassy. Edward was known to police for selling marijuana, and it's speculated that he dabbled in porn and prostitution and was part of a voodoo cult. That all kind of sounds wild, so who knows if it's true. It's just speculated.
That's interesting, but I bet this is going to be another one of those where maybe he targets sex workers.
I guess you'll have to keep listening and find out. So, she thinks she's so smart. So, while they were searching the scene where Edward was found, they actually found another body that had been decapitated and castrated. The body also had the same chemical preservative that was found on the Lady of the Lake. And I didn't preface by saying this, but I've been sick for 2 weeks, so if my voice sounds like it does right now, I'm sorry. So, the coroner determined he was in his 40s. He had been dead for a couple of weeks, but unfortunately, he was never identified.
Were all of these near the water or just that first lady?
They were not all near the water, no. It was around this time that the police began to refer to the killer, like I said, as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run because of his hunting ground and how he dismembered his victims. In January of 1936, a homeless woman rummaging through a dumpster found newspaper-wrapped pieces of human flesh, arms, legs, and a female torso, all packaged in woven baskets, and her head was never found.
Well, if I had waited, that would have answered my next question because that's weird. So he literally wrapped it like meat, how you wrap it in paper. Ugh.
Like a butcher. So that's another reason why his name is fitting. So the body was identified as Florence Polillo, who was an occasional sex worker. The coroner determined her cause of death was decapitation, just like the previous victims.
I guess it makes sense that they're determining the cause of death, decapitation. I'm guessing there are no other major wounds to the body that could have killed these humans. So it's leading them to saying decapitation.
So obviously their other body parts are like being hacked off, but I think there's a way to tell, like based on, I don't know, like blood flow and stuff like that, like if it happened post-mortem or not. So I think that's how they know that the head came first, essentially.
Oh, okay. Because I'm like, you don't hear that much. And I'm like, if these people are so chopped up, I'm trying to figure out how they're saying that that was the, obviously if somebody's decapitated, they're done after that. But it doesn't seem like that would be the first thing, but maybe. Interesting.
So a few months later, in June of 1936, two young boys were going fishing, just walking through Kingsbury Run when they found a pair of pants wadded up. Again, they're poor. It's the Great Depression. So they're like, sweet, let's see if there's any money in the pockets. So they pick up the pants, and instead of money, out rolls a decapitated head. And I'm not sure how old they were, but that would be like traumatic for anybody to experience.
I would never go outside again, pretty much. And then you get excited whenever you find money. I found like $20 or $40, especially as a kid. You're like, oh, first of all, no offense to these kids, but there's no way a head. You said in pants, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm confused, but pants wrapped up with a head in it. I would think that's weird. There's a ball in here, or there's something like that. Not necessarily money would be my first thought, but maybe they were small, which, like you said, is even more traumatizing. It's all bad.
I mean, they're thinking like money in the pockets. They obviously didn't think like it was a wad of cash, and I don't know how the head was wrapped, so simmer down.
Listen, in trousers, I feel like this is the 30s, so we need to say trousers. You can only wrap a head so much. I feel like it would have been even sticking out a bit, but
You could fit the head in the part like where the butt and waist go, and then just kind of, lay off these kids. So the next day, police found the headless body of a man in his 20s next to a railroad track. The body had been cleaned and drained of its blood, like a previous victim. The man had 6 tattoos in various parts of his body, and they determined that the head they found the day before belonged to this man. So remember how I mentioned in the beginning that there were conventions and expositions coming to Cleveland around this time?
yes, I do. September 1934.
Oh, that's the day that she wrote down. That's funny. That's not when the convention was, but hilarious. Okay. So the police had a plaster reproduction of this man's head made, and also a diagram of the locations and kind of tattoos that he had. And this was put on display at the Great Lakes Exposition of 1936. Megan's eyes got wide and she was like, what?
Thank you for translating what my face said. That's kind of weird because they're not coming there for that. I get broadcasting. You know what? Nope, it's the 30s. Maybe there's no like television or news station. So maybe they thought, oh, this is convenient. All these people will be here. We can see if they know this man's tattoos, but it's a little strange. Also, where the heck are all these heads? Do we ever find out?
No, we don't. And I'm glad that you asked because I was thinking the same thing while I was researching. I'm like, where is this man keeping his heads? Like, I'm just picturing like Jeffrey Dahmer, like keeping them. I don't know. I have no idea.
I have a theory of where the heads are.
I would love to hear your theory.
Unfortunately, I think he's hanging them by their feet like you would an animal, decapitating them. That's why the blood's draining out of all their body. And I think he's grinding the heads.
Why?
Because how are none of, like, well, some of them were found, but some of them were never found.
Correct.
But I'm just saying, like, that's what a butcher might do. And that would be easier to grind than the rest. And maybe he thought that was the most identifying part of the body.
I mean, he would be correct. Because the only people who were identified, like, had a criminal history, so they had their fingerprints on file, if you will. And which is still, I feel like, an awesome forensic countermeasure in the 1930s, like being able to even identify people like that. Because imagine how many fingerprints you have to look at, like through a magnifying glass, essentially, before you make a match.
And I know we talked about that before. I can't remember when fingerprints super became a thing, but I know a lot of times when I hear these old cases, it's the teeth. So I could see trying his best to destroy the head because of the teeth. But I guess the only thing that messes up my theory is some of the heads were found. So I don't think he would grind some of them and not others. But maybe he just got unlucky and some of them were found. So maybe he just dispersed it. Ugh.
So even though hundreds of people saw this reproduction, and even with the distinct tattoos, this man was never identified. A month later, a teenage girl was walking through the woods, just minding her own business like all these other people, when she found the headless body of a 40-year-old white male. A pile of bloody clothes and his head were found nearby. The coroner determined he had been dead for 2 months and was probably killed where his body was found because of all the blood that had seeped into the ground. This victim, which was the butcher's fifth, was also never identified.
It just sucks because most of these people walking around were young. I mean, like you said, any adult would also be traumatized, but gosh, it's like kids like walking around. And imagine being like a young girl walking around. I guess young could even be 20s, who knows. But then I'd be terrified. I'd be like looking around like, oh my gosh, I gotta get out of here. But yeah, that sucks.
Yeah, so at this point, I don't think I will let my children just roam around anymore. Like, kids are just finding dismembered bodies all over town. It's getting to be a little insane.
I know. I wonder, is this going to be one of those ones where they finally are like, okay, mass hysteria, everyone stay inside? Because at this point, it's getting a little crazy, like you said. And it's interesting to live in those times. I feel like people were stumbling on bodies on the reg. I'm like, thank goodness. I mean, at least I don't think we're stumbling on bodies like as frequently as people used to.
So this is like the 1930s, not like the bubonic plague in Europe. So I don't think that people are just stumbling upon bodies left and right. I wasn't alive back then, so I cannot confirm, but that is just my hypothesis.
You know what I mean? Them 1930s people were finding bodies all the time.
If they lived in Cleveland, yes. So to keep this going, in September of 1936, a man literally tripped over the upper portion of a male torso while running to get on a train.
Stumbling on bodies, literally. Like I said, he tripped over them. That's crazy.
After searching a nearby sewer, police found the lower half of the torso and his legs. They brought in divers to recover the remains, and there was like 600 plus onlookers because it's the 30s, so what else are you going to do? But victim number 6 was in his 20s, and like the others, he died of decapitation. The coroner noted that there was no hesitation marks with the dismemberment or decapitation, which led him to the conclusion that the killer was confident and familiar with human anatomy. He also said that the victim died instantly when his head was cut off in one clean stroke. Victim number 6 was also never identified.
What are the police doing right now?
They are finding body parts after the citizens of Cleveland find the first body part. And they're like, why are there so many body parts? That's what the police are doing.
Okay. Is there more?
Yes. You know, we were just talking about all these people obviously getting murdered, but because people suck, they were like, well, at least it's like these people. Like, at least it's these lower class, slum living people, you know? But as you asked, what were the police doing? So in December of 1935, famed lawman Elliot Ness became the safety director of Cleveland. Do you know who Elliot Ness is?
I cannot remember names.
So he was known for enforcing prohibition and taking down Al Capone in Chicago.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Elliot.
So he had a reputation for never backing down from the bad guys and always getting the job done. However, he really just ignored the butcher and the piles of bodies that were adding up. Like in the beginning, he was focusing on police corruption, the mob, and traffic safety. But it became a problem that just couldn't be ignored anymore when they realized there's a serial killer on the loose. So in September of 1936, the mayor of Cleveland told Ness to get on the case.
It's not where I thought that was going. You really built that man up, and then you're like, but he didn't care about this case. I'm like,
correct. When you're like, what are the police doing? Well, that's what they were doing.
Getting the mob. I mean, I guess the mob's kind of serial killers as well. So that's pretty important. I get that. However, a bunch of people being decapitated, I don't really care if they're, obviously, we're not condoning that it's okay to kill anyone, sex workers or whatever. But in their perspective, even though it's quote unquote low lives, it's still someone like decapitating human beings. And that's pretty crazy. You probably want to get that under control.
So Ness decided that his first course of action would be to bring in anybody that he thought was weird or sketchy or, you know, whatever. Just round them up. Just round up the weirdos. So it turns out there were a lot of weird people in Cleveland at the time, including a homeless man with 500 pairs of women's shoes, another man who claimed that he could transfer heads from one person to another, and that's just to name a few. So all of these interrogations came up empty, and there were no new leads, and none of these people pointed to being the Mad Butcher.
Yeah, pretty sure let's gather some weirdos is not a scientific way to profile. Just my guess. At first I was going to say a homeless man, but then you said who had a bunch of women's shoes. That is suspect. It doesn't match this crime whatsoever. Then you said the head guy, and I was like, well, I do see that, but I don't know, maybe start with butchers in the vicinity.
So the police ended up putting 2 detectives on the case full time, and they started to immerse themselves in the sketchy area of Kingsbury Run in order to get a handle on the case and to get to know the area that's being victimized. The detectives were Peter Marilow and Martin Zalewski, and they often worked on their own time trying to catch this guy. By the time the two had concluded the investigation, they had interviewed more than 1,500 people, and the department itself interviewed more than 5,000 people. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run is the largest police investigation in Cleveland history. So now the police are on the case, Megan.
It actually sounds like the police are wasting their time. I don't understand what they're doing, but it sounds like they should have narrowed this down a little bit more.
They're talking to anybody and everybody. 5,000 people. Insane. So even with all of the interrogations, they were still coming up empty and the bodies continued piling up. In February of 1937, a man who was walking along the shores of the beach found the upper half of a woman's torso and her lower half washed ashore 3 months later. So unlike the others, she had not died of decapitation. They determined that that had happened after she was already dead, but her cause of death was undetermined. But they did know that she was in her mid-20s, but she was never identified. So only a few months later, in June of 1937, a teenage boy was walking under a bridge and discovered a human skull. Next to the skull was a burlap bag that had all of the skeletal remains of a petite black woman who was around 40 years old. Dental work, as you mentioned earlier, gave the identification of a woman named Rose Wallace. Her cause of death was not specified.
Was she decapitated? So they're all definitely decapitated.
Yes.
Have any butchers whatsoever out of these 5,000 weirdos that they're profiling, any butchers?
That was not specified. It did not say that they were looking just at butchers, or anybody else familiar with anatomy. That was not specified. It just said that they interviewed a lot of people.
It's just a lot of people. Do you know what span of time that was? I mean, this started in 1934 and it's now 1937.
So can you tell me how many years it's been going on? If you have the dates written down. Sounds like 3 years, Megan.
Yeah, but the investigation didn't start until, I think, like the second year in.
Yeah, so it seems like they really started getting serious around like 1935. But, I mean, there was work being done. They weren't just like, oh, there's another head. Just toss that one in the back of the truck, Billy. They were, working it, but maybe not working it with all the resources that they did now.
It sounds like they still have no resources, but we'll see where this is going. If this is an unsolved, I'm going to be very upset. I'm just gonna say that now.
They always are. They always are upset when it's an unsolved one. So the next month in July of 1937, the National Guard was in Cleveland because there were labor strikes going on in the area. A couple of guardsmen saw body parts floating in the river where they were standing guard. Just floating in the river. Just floating down the river. Like, upon retrieval, the body parts were able to be put together except for the head. So they were able to piece together, an entire body except for the head. When the abdomen was examined, they noticed that it had been gutted and the heart was ripped out. So this was new to the butcher, as he'd never done this with any previous victim. So the detectives were like, okay, he's obviously getting more vicious in his killings as time goes on. This victim was the butcher's 9th and was never identified, but was estimated to be in his mid to late 30s.
It seems like a ton of victims, but I guess for most serial killers, it's 9 over the span of several years. So I guess it could be more. It just feels crazy how everybody's just finding the body parts.
Yeah. So the public is now wondering, like, how is somebody murdering so many people and disposing of various body parts in different locations and has not yet been caught? How is he going undetected for so long, like with literally no leads?
I feel the same way as the public, and especially after interviewing 5,000 people, it doesn't make sense.
I mean, that was at the end of the investigation, the total. So at this point, I don't know how many they had interrogated, but still, like, to interrogate all those people and not to have anything, like, how is nobody seeing a man or woman walking around just like, oh, I'm going to plop a head right here. I'm just going to throw a leg in here. I'm just going to wrap this in here, and nobody sees anything.
It's also strange that no one knows any of the victims, other sex workers, if they're sex workers, or what if the other guy might have been a drug dealer, even with all the tattoos. It's weird that nobody knows them and was like, oh yeah, I know that guy. I know that girl. Yeah, she was hanging out with this weird person Friday night. Usually that's how stuff eventually gets found, but I don't know.
So victim number 10 was discovered in April of 1938 when a young worker was on his way to work and saw what he thought was a dead fish along the banks of the river. So just like when people find bodies in the woods and people say it's never a mannequin, well, this definitely was not a fish. When he got closer, he realized that it was the lower half of a woman's leg. It took months of searching the river for them to find both parts of her torso, the rest of both of her legs, and burlap sacks. So that's another thing. I mean, maybe that was a common material used back then, but all of the things have been found in burlap sacks. When the coroner examined her body, he found drugs in her system. The kind of drug was not specified, but he also couldn't determine if the killer gave her these drugs to immobilize her or if she was an addict. And he was hoping he would find out more, once he found her arms, to see if there were any, needle marks or anything. But unfortunately, they were never recovered, and she was never identified. So this was the first victim that had drugs in her system. And so I feel like it would be more likely that she was an addict, because why would he suddenly need to, use drugs to immobilize victims when he didn't need to do that before?
I agree. That's what I was thinking on that one.
On August 16th, 1938, 3 men collecting scraps found the torso of a woman wrapped in a man's blazer and then wrapped again in a quilt. Next to that was a box that had her arms and legs wrapped in butcher paper and then rubber banded together. They also found her head wrapped the same way. This time it also looked like some of the body parts had been refrigerated.
It's so weird because there's a lot of weird, it's obviously in general very much the same, but then each one has little tiny random differences. It's just interesting and creepy.
I thought the same thing. I'm like, well, what if it wasn't all the same person? But then it's like, what are the odds that there's another maniac running around this area? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's too close to not be the same, but then there's just these weird little things. And then why refrigerate it? It's not like he's keeping well, he did put that stuff to preserve some of them. I don't know. I don't know who this guy is.
While searching the area for evidence of victim number 11, police also found pieces of victim 12 only yards away. Both of these victims had been placed in plain view of Elliot Ness's office to taunt him. Neither of these victims were identified.
So now the guy's they've interviewed 6,000 people. I added 1,000. And they don't know who I am, so now he's being smart and getting bold.
Exactly. And after being clearly taunted by the Mad Butcher, Elliot Ness ordered a raid of what they called the Hobo Jungle of Kingsbury Run. So on August 18th, 1938, only 2 days after finding the 11th and 12th victims, Ness and 35 officers in 11 squad cars, 2 police vans, and 3 fire trucks pull into Kingsbury Run a little before 1 a.m. The police took in 63 men and searched the shacks for clues. When nothing turned up, Safety Director Ness ordered all the shacks to be burned down, literally people's homes just burned to the ground.
What did you just call this?
They called it the Hobo Jungle.
What the heck does that mean? Is that because they went and basically got a bunch of hobo? Why did they call it the Hobo Jungle?
Because a lot of hobos live there.
So they just went and got random people, basically, and burned their homes down for absolutely no reason.
Correct. He was highly criticized for this.
That's terrible. Yeah, he should be. That's freaking crazy. And once again, you're just adding to your numbers without looking at any bits and parts. I shouldn't say bits and parts.
Poor choice of words.
That was a very poor choice of words. Not looking at any of the facts of the crime, like you mentioned. A lot of it's the burlap bag, the materials, the coat, the paper that it's wrapped in, the butcher. First of all, it was kind of like some of these other crimes back in the 30s and the old ones. They're it's an insane man or it's a hobo. And the crimes are done so well that it's like, no, it's actually probably someone possibly educated or with some type of schooling, or a butcher, someone with a skill or a trade. But in these times, they just always look like it's a crazy man or it's a homeless person. That was very, very bad, Mr. Elliot Ness. Looked at my notes.
I was going to congratulate you on remembering his name. So, even though the raid turned up no evidence or clues, the murders stopped. Megan's mind is blown.
I'm about to be so mad. Continue.
In July of 1939, a year after the raid, Cleveland Sheriff Martin O'Donnell arrested a 52-year-old bricklayer named Frank Dolezal for the murder of Flo Polillo. Frank had lived with Flo for a while and had also known Edward Andrassy and Rose Wallace. So those are three, pretty much the only identified victims of the butcher. This man was associated with all three of them. A coincidence?
So he got arrested for killing who?
Flo Polillo, who was one of the butcher's victims.
Why did he get arrested?
After talking to people and realizing that he knew all, three of the victims, he was arrested and brought in.
Okay. We'll see.
So Frank did, quote unquote, confess to being the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, but the confession is speculated to be coerced because it was like half ramblings and half very specific details, as if somebody was like feeding him the information. And before he was set to go to trial, Frank Dolezal was found dead by hanging in his cell, only an inch off the ground. So they said that he was like 5'7". He hung himself off of his bedding, like bed rail or whatever. That was 5'8". So that's wild. Nobody believes that Frank is actually the Mad Butcher. There's a lot of speculation that Elliot Ness solved the case on the DL because the actual killer had high-profile connections. So the media had heard rumors that the real killer was a man known as Dr. X, who was a physician with mental health issues. His real name was Francis Sweeney, and his family was very respectable in the Cleveland area, and his cousin was a congressman. So needless to say that if he came out as the Mad Butcher, or even being suspected of being the Mad Butcher, that would be a huge stain on the family. And also if Elliot Ness accused him of being the Mad Butcher and he wasn't, that would be a huge, dent on Elliot Ness as well. So Francis Sweeney provided medical supplies for the U.S. military in World War I. Then he was a pharmacist and then a doctor in Cleveland. He was happily married until he developed a barbiturate and alcohol addiction and began having violent episodes. So between 1933 and 1938, he had multiple competency hearings, which he barely passed. And I'm sure, as you know, because you were taking notes, those were the exact years that the butcher was active in Cleveland. So because of his family connections, Ness brought Sweeney in for an interrogation at the Cleveland Hotel instead of the police station so that the press didn't find out. He ended up being interrogated for literally 2 weeks without an attorney present, and he was questioned for hours at a time. Throughout all the interviews, Sweeney never confessed or gave any incriminating information. But soon after the end of his interrogation, Sweeney was put into the first of many mental hospitals where he stayed for the rest of his life. So this happened around the time of the raid and burning of the shacks, so the timing of that and Sweeney being put in an institution all coincided with the murder's ending. And when Elliot Ness was interviewed about the case years later, he was asked what happened to the butcher. He paused and said, "That case has been solved. That's it."
I have no idea. I was going to say I didn't know it was taking that little plot twist, but I was going to say I'm not convinced it was that guy. Yeah, he knew some of the people, but I bet a lot of people knew some of the people in that area. It was kind of like a condensed specific area. I also feel like they killed him. It would take some willpower to hang yourself an inch above ground where you could easily, your flight or fight would kick in. Strangling is not, because that would be the hard type of strangling. that would be like you have to wait until it's done. I feel like your fight or flight would kick in and you would just put your feet on the ground. So that was suspect to me. I feel like they killed him and then hung him there.
His autopsy did reveal that he had 6 broken ribs that all occurred when he was in police custody. So that could be the case. Like, oh, we don't want it to go to trial because we have like no evidence. So let's just accuse him, say he did it, and get rid of him and not have to like do that whole evidence thing. And if he did think that it was the doctor, then, this is a way of just keep sweeping that under the rug, keeping that under wraps to protect everybody's reputation, and just basically like using this man as a scapegoat.
Yeah, and then he would have known the murders will stop because we do know who it is, but we're going to use this guy as a cover. That's interesting. Oh, it feels unsolved still.
I mean, it technically is unsolved.
Yeah, because I don't know enough about the Sweeney guy either.
I'm sorry that it's unsolved when you're like, better freaking not be unsolved. But according to Elliot Ness, it has been solved, so take that for what it's worth.
I think those are even more frustrating because it's like those weird ones where it's like, okay, the cops know something, but no one else will ever know. It's interesting he was concerned about that when he's willing to like take down a mob. That's a pretty big ruffling feathers. There's usually a lot of politics and corruption in that. So how are you going to be okay with taking down like that type of corruption, but not outing this man?
Well, maybe this man's family was like good people and he doesn't care about taking down like a crime family or, stuff like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't care who it is. If you're getting murdered, I mean, if you're murdering, you're getting outed because you just shouldn't murder people, especially in that brutal. No, at all. You should not murder people. But that's just really brutal. The public deserves to know,
I do know. And I don't know. It's just crazy that, it stopped, right? Like this man gets institutionalized and it just stops. Nothing says why they would have stopped if it was Frank. You know what I mean? Because he didn't get arrested until a year later. So if it was Frank, like what made him stop? Because you burned down some shacks or what? You know what I mean?
These cases that are like, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But the Sweeney guy sounds like it sounds like more of what we were thinking, like someone who was educated, went mad, that type of thing, knew about, what would you say he did again? Physician. So definitely would know about the body. And the other guy just seemed like such a scapegoat. And the hanging was so sus.
I agree. All right. So I guess let us know what y'all think. Follow us on Instagram at Murder in the Mountains. I may even post this in the Facebook discussion group. Let's get that going again. Megan's like, whoop, whoop. I wish I could see her because sometimes she forgets to speak. And so you don't know what her reactions are. But yes, y'all can join our Facebook discussion group as well. You can even talk to Megan. I'm sure she'll post something. She's shaking her head no, but she really will. And come back next week for another episode of Murder in the Mountains. See ya.
Goodbye.